Hello, my name is Frank Gaffney. I'm delighted to be continuing a conversation with Greg Scarlatoiu. He is one of the country's, I think, indeed, one of the world's most thoughtful and most effective champions of freedom for the people of North Korea. We're talking with him today about what is likely to produce freedom, or at least give a greater prospect for it, of course, most immediately for the people of North Korea. But what's necessary to assure that the freedoms enjoyed by the people of South Korea is preserved as well? Greg, it's good to have you with us, and I want to thank you for the expertise that you bring to these topics. Jesus Christ famously blessed the peacemakers, and I think most of us yearn to be conduits for peace and enabling it to break out, as it were, around the world. A particularly hard target for peace is the Korean Peninsula, which has been divided for decades since the end of the hostilities in the Korean War. But there's never been an armistice to formally end that war. And what some who profess to be interested in peace are now championing is engineering an armistice, essentially by American diktat. I'd like you to talk a little bit about what are the risks of pursuing, in a well-intentioned perhaps, but quite possibly very counterproductive way, the peace that we all yearn for, specifically with the North Korean regime.
Frank, a great pleasure joining you. And let me begin by saying that I am a proponent of peace. I'm a peace lover, not a peace hater. I run a human rights organization. Everything we do, day in and day out, we do it in order to bring peace, reconciliation, human rights, freedom, and justice to all North Koreans, to all Koreans. The ones who need it right now, of course, most are the Korean people living in North Korea.
Let me just say bless you for that work. I think it's vital.
I thank you for that blessing, Frank. And let me also say that there are several ways of ending a war. And as you said, all we've had since July the 27th, 1953, has been a halting of hostilities, an armistice. There's no peace treaty. Do we want a peace treaty? Absolutely. Would we be against peace if Koreans truly wanted it? Absolutely not. There are hazards here. When one starts talking about peace declarations and peace treaties, one has to remember that the absolutely overwhelming threat of the North Korean military is still there. Of course, one way of ending a war is unconditional surrender, and we do not want to do that.
Yeah. We've seen recently in Afghanistan, of course, that you can declare an end to an endless war. But if the other side is still fighting, or is still prepared to fight at the very least, that does translate effectively into surrender. In that case, appallingly humiliating surrender at that. Would such an outcome be likely, given what you've described in terms of the correlation of forces on the Korean, demilitarized zone at the moment?
South Koreans are wonderful soldiers. They're wonderful people. They're wonderful war fighters. And South Korea needs the U.S.-South Korea alliance in order to preserve and defend the Republic of Korea, South Korea. Military experts will talk to you about this in more detail, I'm sure, but simply the numbers, the resources, the gear, the intelligence, they're simply not there. It's as simple as that. They need the alliance. We've had this alliance since 1953. Well, since the beginning of the Korean War, since 1950. You brought up Afghanistan, Frank. What had happened if we, the United States, had left South Korea, just pulled up stakes and left 20 years after the armistice in 1973? South Korea was not an economic powerhouse. Park Chung-hee was a developmental dictator. It was a failure. I mean, nothing on par with the prison camps that the North Koreans had been running for so many decades. It was a tough military dictatorship, so that's where we would have left South Korea in 1973.
At best.
At best.
At worst, you would have had the North in the South.
The
again.
North, yes, absolutely. We have had the patience to stay. We have had the patience to cherish and develop this alliance with our great allies, friends, and partners in South Korea. And look at South Korea today. It has thrived. Of course, it has its own issues, like many other democracies, and you and I
think
will.
all of them.
All of them, absolutely. And yet we had the patience and resilience to stay. 80% of the North Korean military is forward deployed south of the Pyongyang-Wonsan line, poised to invade the South. So,
and again, just give us a sense of the order of battle that would represent 80% of
1.2 million.
1.2.
1.2 million. You're talking 100,000 special forces pouring down south. You're talking about long-range artillery placed on the Kaesong Heights. Seoul is within reach from North Korean artillery pieces dug into mountains. They bring them out of that tunnel. They fire. By the time the shell has hit a target in Seoul, the artillery piece is already inside the mountain once again. But again, I'm the human rights guy. I won't get into those.
Understood. But it is a question of the threat to the human rights of the people of South Korea, if that were to happen. And you're saying, Greg, that the presence of U.S. forces, which has been painfully, in some cases, maintained, certainly expensively maintained, with the help of the South Korean government and people, let's be clear, has kept the peace and made possible this incredible transformation in South Korea. And yet we're hearing people who would love to be recognized for their peacemaking prowess insisting that this is the moment for the United States essentially to simply, effectively surrender to the North Koreans. Greg, so we've been talking about the nostrums of peace and taking nothing away from people who aspire to it. There are examples throughout history of failed efforts to achieve it, many of which seem to have in common a misperception of the character of the enemy with whom you're trying to make peace and how they'll respond to misbegotten or at least ill-advised peace initiatives. Which brings me to the legislative initiative that is now under consideration in the House of Representatives of the United States. It's known as its bill number H.R. 3446, the Peace on the Korean Peninsula Act, I believe is its formal title. When you look at that legislation, what does it do, and then what's wrong with it?
Frank, first let me say this. Blessed be the peacemakers. We all want reconciliation, peace, eventual unification under a free, democratic, prosperous Republic of Korea. That said, unconditional surrender is also a way to obtain peace. We have to remember the nature of the Kim family regime of North Korea. It was the Kim family regime, it was Kim Il-sung that ordered the invasion of South Korea on June the 25th, 1950. It is the North Korean regime that has been conducting countless provocations against South Korea since 1953, since the July 27th, 1953 armistice. It is the North Korean regime that has been sacrificing the human rights and human security of its own people in order to build nuclear weapons and ballistic missiles that threatened South Korea and the region. It is the Kim family regime that has 1.2 million men and women in uniform. 80% of them are forward deployed south of the Pyongyang-Wonsan line. 100,000 special forces ready to pour down south. Seoul is within range from the long-range North Korean artillery placed on the Kaesong Heights. The Kim family regime is not exactly a peacemaker. If you look at its posture, this is a regime that's poised to attack, poised to invade. So there is the very important security aspect. And there is no doubt that the U.S.-South Korea alliance has safeguarded the peace, prosperity, and freedom of the people of South Korea to the present day.
So if this bill were to be enacted, and there's another version of a similarly, I believe, misbegotten legislation in the Senate. But assuming that this were to come to pass, what would be the practical effects of the declaration of peace that it would call for between the United States and the North Koreans, I guess, as well as the South Koreans? Is that right?
There may be a natural progression to making a new set of arguments that now a peace treaty is needed. And indeed, if there is a peace treaty between the top leadership of South Korea and North Korea, what are we going to do? Are we going to prevent this from happening? I'm not so sure. One has to remember that this
even if there are good arguments for not letting it happen, including 1.2 million people more or less poised to invade the South again.
Absolutely. And my concern here is that such a progression could lead to the argument being made that there is no need for a U.S. military presence on the Korean Peninsula. There is no need for USFK. There is no need for the U.S.-Korea alliance. South Korea is, after all, a developed country that can stand for itself, and there is nothing to worry about when this is actually not the situation on the ground. South Koreans are great war fighters, great soldiers, great people. They're great friends, allies, and partners of the United States. But for a variety of reasons, they do need the alliance for their national defense. There is no doubt about that.
But, Greg, you make it sound as though this is a possibility, a hypothetical that might flow from passage of a piece of legislation like H.R. 3446. And yet, if you study even very superficially the policies of Moon Jae-in and his senior subordinates, that's pretty much their stated ambition, is it not? To get rid of the U.S.-South Korea alliance and create a new arrangement of some kind, maybe even unification on the North Koreans' terms. No?
As far as Moon Jae-in is concerned, I'm not aware of any public statements against the U.S.-South Korea alliance. But certainly President Moon Jae-in comes from a school of thought where he's fully focused on reconciliation and rapprochement with Kim Jong-un. Mm-hmm. For the sake of that rapprochement, he has been sacrificing fundamental human rights in South Korea on the altar of this so-called rapprochement. When it comes to the bill here, I have a very serious concern. And that serious concern has me worry about that progression I mentioned earlier. There's nothing about North Korean human rights in the bill. How can we even fathom a conversation about a peace declaration with a regime that keeps 120,000 people in political prison camps, a regime that maims and tortures, imprisons and starves its own people and turns them into slave laborers? Mm-hmm. How can we talk about a peace declaration with a regime that continues with these abysmal practices of forced abortions, infanticide, targeting North Korean women refugees who were sent back from China and were pregnant with Chinese men? I'm a peace lover, and I'm all for peace, and I would strongly argue that there can be no true peace without human rights. There can be no true peace without justice for the people of North Korea. I lived on the other side of the Iron Curtain. And every time we saw this kind of effort, we tended to be very cynical, saying, my goodness, they had them tricked again. We knew what the reality on the ground was. And, of course, we do have to factor in the people, because this would be peace between the people living in the South and living in the North. Well, so,
if it's real, it will be. If it's not, it almost certainly won't be. But I wanted to take advantage of your experience with Romania back during the Cold War. One of the very as it turns out, epical events was the adoption by both the East and West of something that came to be called the Helsinki Accords, of which there was a basket 4 that was essentially a vehicle for promoting human rights and making it an obligation of the Eastern Bloc, the Soviet Union and its empire, to at least pay lip service to, if not actually accommodate efforts that were designed to promote human rights in the Warsaw Pact. That turned out to be very corrosive to the regime. in Moscow specifically and its counterparts in your country and elsewhere. Might the same apply here if we make it a priority? If we don't, we're writing that option off, are we not?
The Helsinki precedent, I would argue, as you said, Frank, shows that multilateral human rights diplomacy with the DPRK might be possible. President Reagan's and Secretary Shultz's approach to the issue of refuseniks in the Soviet Union proves that there is also a bilateral avenue to address human rights. What we also have to keep in mind was that for those living in Eastern Europe at the time, for the regular Joes, so to say, this didn't really make such a big difference, at least not for us in Romania, not in the 1980s. Nevertheless, these efforts are very important, and I will be fully in favor of remembering precisely that both multilateral and bilateral human rights diplomacy might work. Multilateral diplomacy worked at the UN with human rights in North Korea being placed on the agenda of the UN Security Council, for example, being included.
And a special rapporteur.
Having a special rapporteur, absolutely.
Yeah.
One caveat about the North Koreans. It is truly the Korean Workers' Party that calls all the shots. Mm-hmm. They have this outer layer, this outer infrastructure layer that makes their diplomacy and diplomats look normal. Of course, any diplomat has to follow an executive agenda, but in their case, they basically go from scenario A to B to C and back to A to B to C, and that's how they would handle this. If you look at their reporting on human rights, on paper, it almost looks okay. Yeah. But of course, what's actually happening
in practice
on the ground
is a different thing.
Is extraordinarily different.
I just have to ask quickly, before we get to what should we be doing instead, it seems unbelievable that there are people who are running influence operations on behalf of such an odious regime. And yet, my sense of it is, Greg, that they are, in fact, making progress to some extent in academic circles, in the media in this country, and unfortunately on Capitol Hill as well. I don't know if you'd agree with me, but I have the feeling that's what's going on with this legislation that's been advanced by people who seem to be sympathetic to the North's position.
No, Frank, let me begin with a disclaimer. I've come across no evidence that Capitol Hill is under the influence of these North Korean agents of the Kim regime. That said, of course, these operations have been carried out all over the world, primarily by the UFD, the United Front Department of North Korea, whose mission is to subvert, undermine South Korea and Koreans all over the world. Mm-hmm. There is, of course, also the Propaganda and Agitation Department, the PAD, that produces propaganda not only for domestic use but also for foreign audiences. And there is the RGB, the Reconnaissance General Bureau, that conducts kinetic operations such as the assassination of Kim Jong-nam, the half-brother in Malaysia with VX nerve agents. So these are the North Korean
another
peacemakers.
Indicator of the attitude of the regime, even to its own family members, for heaven's sakes, let alone other people of the North. But quickly, Greg, given all of this, and my own feeling about it is that the influence operations are operating on the Hill, but we can debate that point. The main purpose of this program, though, is to highlight the reason we should care about human rights in North Korea, why it should matter to us as freedom-loving people, and what we should do to advance it. You have a paper that I know is going to be part of an important booklet on this general subject of the North and specifically this legislation. Talk a little bit about what we should be doing instead of trying to promote a peace declaration, which could be really dangerously counterproductive.
Frank, as one who lived on the other side of the Iron Curtain and is a naturalized American, I know that human rights is a fundamental distinctive feature of the American character, the American national identity, our identity as Americans. Caring about the human rights of others, not only about our own, is ethically, politically, religiously, morally the right thing to do.
Amen.
There's, of course, the precedent of the 20th and 21st century, as much of the 21st as we've witnessed. We've seen that in the age of industrial warfare, despots who egregiously violate the rights of their own people become threats to regional and international peace and security, especially if they're armed with weapons of mass destruction.
Yes.
So North Korean human rights is more than just a human rights issue. It's a fundamental threat to the peace and security of the region, even beyond the Korean Peninsula.
If those rights are denied, or worse yet, systematically accompanied by the most cruel oppression imaginable, which is, I think, the principal product of the North Korean regime. Greg Scarlatoiu, let me just say that that very strong endorsement of our values and why it should be at the cornerstone of our policies is one of the things that I admire so much about people like yourself. I call them foreign-born American patriots because they have an appreciation of what has made this country not only unique but so important in the world, and that you understand in ways that many of us who take such rights and such values for granted because we had the privilege of growing up here, to heart and to teach the rest of us not only how important they are, but how ephemeral they can be. Greg, thank you so much for the work you do at the Committee on North Korean Freedom. We're delighted to have a chance to talk with you. I appreciate the fact that all of you have joined us as well, and I hope you will do so again for our next program. Until then, this is Frank Gaffney. Thanks for listening.